America is reeling from its failed war in Afghanistan. It's the latest in a catalogue of problems, from increasing social division and political paralysis at home, to its seeming inability to lead a global mission to tackle climate change. This, against the backdrop of an increasingly dominant China, has led many to believe America is losing its power and standing in the world. US editor John Prideaux joins Washington bureau chief James Astill and senior editor James Bennett to discuss whether these are genuine signs of a superpower in decline.
So my question to you is America in decline? And how do you go about thinking about that question?
And I think the top line is that it doesn't need to be. America has blundered in its foreign policy spectacularly in the past and come back equally spectacularly. There was a great deal of declinism around in the mid-late 70s after the disaster in Vietnam. And, a little more than a decade later, America had won the Cold War and was embarking on a period of untrammeled unipolar supremacy. The sources of America's, enormous strength are still pretty much intact. It has a young population. It has a flagging but still, rather impressive degree of economic dynamism. It has problems, absolutely, and it has growing problems around inequality, some of its poor social indicators around health and education. It has a growing climate crisis of its own. I would suggest that these are considerable problems, new problems, but America has faced considerable new problems in the past. In the past, it has had an impressive ability to change tack, to improvise, to problem solve. America's ability to get things wrong and then reinvent itself is famously one of its great qualities. And the thing that gives so many of us pause right now in response to that question, is America in absolute decline, is that its problem-solving ability has been somewhat stagnant for a good while. And this is, of course, a result of the extreme political dysfunction that we see at the federal level. The dysfunction is being exacerbated by extremism on both sides, but in particular, far right of the Republican Party, which is now the balance of power in the Republican base, which seems to be turning against those problem-solving institutions, in particular, American democracy itself. Hence, the violent end to the Trump administration, the so-called coup attempt that took place on Capitol Hill in January.
James Bennett, same question to you, but perhaps let's stick with the foreign policy piece of this for now, rather than talking about domestic policy.
I do think it's hard not to conclude that America largely wasted its unipolar opportunity over the last 30 years in foreign policy, that it found itself, somewhat to its surprise, the victor of the Cold War in the early 1990s. It was followed by this kind of time of searching in the Clinton years to figure out what America's proper role in the world should be, what it should do with all this economic and military might. And there was some to and froing about liberal interventionism. Should we be using America's power to advance human rights? We didn't do so in Rwanda, where we could have prevented a genocide. We did do so in probably from learning that lesson in the Balkans. And then came 9/11, and that in many ways supplied the orientation that the leadership class, the national security establishment, was looking for, and clarified to many people's minds what America's role in the world should be. And it argued very much in favor of intervention wherever we detected a threat, regardless of sovereign boundaries. And we're now at the end of really this 20-year experiment in power projection And I can understand why it looks and can feel to an American like decline, because it involves retreat. I mean, America is withdrawing from its very aggressive posture in the world. It's withdrawing from Afghanistan, obviously, and ending combat operations in Iraq.
There's been a lot of articles and think tank papers recently about American overreach in foreign policy. If something like the Rwandan genocide were underway now, do you think America would send troops to attempt to stop it? Or do you think that the fatigue with the 9/11 wars and with the deployment of America's military in what now seem like causes that aren't central to the national interest would mean that America would revert to its mid-90s posture?
The Biden administration is chock full of former advocates of liberal intervention. Biden himself voted for the Iraq War, voted for the Afghanistan War, and was one of the leading proponents of intervention in Bosnia, intervention of some kind in Bosnia in the mid-90s. So that elite opinion, I suggest, is not sort of completely changed and become isolationist, has aligned itself with the instinctive, very, very long-standing public reluctance to see America engage militarily in the world. And I think that, for one thing, a cataclysmic event, another 9/11 or some other, perhaps unimaginable catalyst of that nature would change everything. And America still has the capabilities, and in many of its institutions, especially the Department of Defense, the instincts to intervene militarily in the world. So I wouldn't rule that out.
I think we should switch now to the domestic part of American decline. What longer-term investments can American leaders and citizens make to turn around, especially America's political and social decline?
Evidence for America, the continuing dynamism of the American economy, the power of immigrant contribution to American life, the ability of Americans to kind of invent the future. Exhibit A for that is probably now what's happened in Silicon Valley over the last few decades, and most recently the rise of these social networks in the U.S. They are also now a huge source of our political difficulty, and how they figure out what their responsibilities are to American civic culture, not just American, I think, but global civic culture, and then how they enforce those responsibilities is just a huge question. And we've seen Facebook, Twitter, take some baby steps towards acknowledging that responsibility and trying to act on it. But I don't pretend it's an easy problem to solve. It's a tremendous difficulty, and it's part of what is, I think, injecting on a daily basis venom into our political life, poison into our political discourse, and also just making it harder and harder to do anything about other sorts of institutional problems. The infrastructure bill actually gives me a little bit of hope, because here's a problem that I think we can all acknowledge the U.S. has had for some time. And we actually have seen a major piece of bipartisan legislation, thanks to really hard, patient work by some legislators, make it through. And so that suggests it's not actually impossible.
How much do you think will be solved by these infrastructure bills? What's about to happen is quite a big deal, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think very much the combination of the infrastructure bill passed as we expect in the regular way, with the more partisan budget bill that the Democrats want to throw a couple or maybe even $3 trillion of spending into to enforce, in terms of soft infrastructures, social services, etc. What they're spending on hard infrastructure. That combination, inefficient spending money, not necessarily the best way to reform and improve America, nonetheless, does represent a lot of potential progress. And I would signal the prospects for a massive rollout of climate-related infrastructure, which in turn has the potential to change the politics of climate change in certain industries and interest groups, and in the states, perhaps even more than at the national level. That's a big deal. And after, you know, these decades of essentially no major movement on climate at the federal level in America, that's something to watch and be optimistic about.
James B., I'm going to give what I think will probably be the last word to you. You began by talking about this history of declinism in America. Is this just something cyclical that's going on now? How do you tell when declinism is justified and when it's not?
Declinism does have a long and honorable tradition in American history. It really does go right back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Almost as soon as people arrived here, they were worried that the settlers arrived, that things were going to hell. This does not mean the declinists aren't ultimately going to be right, but it is part of our national character, and arguably actually is historically kind of a source of strength. The parallels have been drawn between this period and the late 19th century, I think, for very good reason, in terms of the degree of disorienting change that we've experienced, the capture of our politics by big money and big interest. Henry Adams was probably the most eloquent voice then for American decline or global decline. I mean, among the things he cited as evidence of civilizational decay was Impressionism. So, he had a good case to be made. He adduced some data points that don't look so good in retrospect. But the point is that what came out of that was, again, as in the 70s, a period of really tremendous reform and rejuvenation, the progressive era. And the hopeful part of me, notwithstanding the degree of political stasis that we're experiencing, clings to the idea that we can pull that off again.
You can read more of our coverage on American Power by clicking on the link. Thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.